So if we had to make this decision that, well, if that's what we're going to be, then that's what we have to be, and we actually have to switch our business development model to go out and start selling to conservation organizations, selling to zoos, selling to aquariums, and making it a business that way. But if we're not willing to do that, then we shouldn't just kind of continue down this path, because we're not kind of accomplishing what we wanted to accomplish. So we did, about a year and a half ago, make this decision that, where I said, we need to, in a way, stop. And stopping is difficult because a lot of people, the people on your team get affected by the fact that you stop. But we need to stop, and we need to rethink, if we were to build Internet of Elephants today, how would we build it from scratch, but with the benefit of everything that we've learned, the networks that we've created, and the credibility that we've established, that are in our back pocket. But how would I build this up from scratch?
Hi, Gautam. Thanks so much for joining us on the light side of green. I'm really excited to talk to you today, notably about your work and founding of the organization Internet of Elephants, which we'll get into. But before we get there, I wanted to start off with a little bit of context in your background. And I'm in particular interested in how you got from your experience with Accenture to where you are now, founding a nature tech startup in this space. So maybe if we could start there, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks so much for having me on. So yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, I worked for Accenture. So I worked for Accenture right out of college in Chicago, which is where I was born and brought up, and I worked for them for the better part of 20 years. I used to spend all my holidays and all my money going on wildlife holidays. So I had been everywhere to see and have experiences with all different types of animals. So that was always my passion. But yeah, I mean, I enjoyed working at Accenture. I enjoyed working in IT. But I was always expressing my interest in wildlife by going on those holidays. Um, there came a point, and I remember the exact moment. Is I was actually in Antarctica, and I was literally sitting at the edge of the world, and it was just me. I just kind of escaped some of the people. I was just sitting there, and there's a penguin sitting there with me, and we're just kind of both looking out into the ocean. And I have a picture of that moment. And it was so spectacular. But the thing that just really kind of, well, what I was feeling at that moment was, this is so unbelievably selfish. Um, the only person, this is amazing, and the only person benefiting, or the only thing that's benefiting from this, is myself. So I started to feel very gluttonous, like, what am I doing? I'm just traveling the world, and I'm having these gluttonous, I called it wildlife gluttony. And it was really the moment where I was like, yeah, this has got to change. Like, I can't imagine, like, the rest of my life just kind of going in this way. I've got to actually figure out, how is it that I'm going to use some of my background towards something more, something more meaningful. At that point, I didn't know if it would be wildlife or not. So that was the moment that things just started to shift for me, and I switched into the nonprofit practice of Accenture. And I said, okay, well, the nonprofit practice allows me to apply what I know, but apply it to a different sector. That sent me to Nairobi. And then I was doing IT strategy work for organizations, social enterprises, NGOs, government, in youth economic empowerment, in education, in agriculture, in health, and all these things that I knew nothing about, but there was some role for me to play. Um, and that's actually what then gave me the confidence to say, but wait a second, I don't know anything about these things, but there is value for me to provide. Therefore, there must be value for me to provide in the wildlife conservation sector. And that gave me the confidence to just go ahead and quit my job of 20 years, basically, at that point, like what I call a perfectly good job, and decide that I was going to get into wildlife conservation. And I was already in Kenya, so going back to Chicago to start your wildlife conservation career didn't make a lot of sense. So I stayed here and started to try and make contacts, tried to learn more about like what are really the problems, what are really the core issues, what's needed, and what's the role that I can play.
Okay, excellent. And so you started to explore different problems that you were seeing, and eventually you got to Internet of Elephants. Um, could we just maybe explore sort of some of the ideas, some of the problems that you were seeing prior to, or that was sort of led you towards setting up Internet of Elephants?
Sure. Yeah, and you've got to find, right, that confluence of the problems plus something that you have the ability or passion to to do something about. So like there's certain things associated with like there's like, well, yeah, these are massive problems that I there's not much that I have to lend to this. There's plenty of experienced people that know what they're doing, on some of these issues, and there's no need for me to come in and be like, hey, here's a guy that really wants to help. So I was really looking for that confluence of something that got me excited, something that really needed to be done, and something that that I had the ability to do. And it really went back to what I was saying earlier was, well, I was having all these amazing experiences, and I kept thinking, what if everybody had those experiences? Yeah, and it just what if, what if, obviously impossible, but what if everybody got to spend the time with animals and the time in nature, etc., that I was privileged enough to be able to do? How would the world be different? How would how would people buy differently? How would people vote differently? How would people donate differently? Like, just what would it do to people's lives? Like, would the same thing happen to their lives as happened to mine? And I just kept thinking about that. I kept thinking about it. I was like, well, even if 10% of everybody, was able to make that shift, or really, feel, some of those things that I felt like there could be a profound, difference to, to conservation. Not that I'm some amazing conservationist or anything, anything like that. But again, it's just that emotion, that emotional connection with wildlife and with animals that I feel like I have. I think it could make a big difference if if a lot of people had that, if a lot of people had those same opportunities as well. Now, again, back to, that's not possible, right? But what is it that technology could do? And of course, my brain was just of course focused a little bit on technology, because again, that's my background. And so I kept thinking about, what is it that technology could do that could help create those connections. And this was sort of at a time where the concept of Internet of Things was getting a lot of press, and it was a trendy, it was a trendy topic, and Cisco was calling it Internet of Everything. And I just started thinking, but people are connected to people all over the world. That makes a big difference. Now people are connected to their refrigerators, they're connected to their doorbells, they're connected to their cars. What if they were in some way connected to wildlife, and by wildlife I mean like individual animals? What if technology could help create a relationship between somebody in Kansas City, and an orangutan far away, or Moituria the elephant in Kenya? And could that, could, again, it was a lot of questions, like what could happen if you did that? What if you woke up in the morning and you reached over for your mobile phone, and the first thing you wanted to do is you wanted to check on what's going on with a penguin in Antarctica, or a jaguar in Brazil, at the individual level? Could you develop a relationship, again, a relationship with those animals? And if you did, how does that start to seep into your existence, and seep into your value systems, and seep into the things that you do? And so, with the whole thing on Internet of Things, I just thought, like, well, what if there was an Internet of Elephants? And of course, not specific to elephants, but just this idea that we could all be connected in some way, especially with the amount of technology that's being used to track animals, to understand animals. All of that data, maybe it's got more than just scientific value. Maybe there's actually an emotional a value of it, or an engagement value of it. And that's where I was like, okay, I don't know, I have no idea, but that seems like a really good question for me to dive into. And I can see certain applications of how we can, of how we can do that, and enhance the, the creation of Internet of Elephants as a business.
Yeah, I love the name. I find it incredibly intriguing, as well as is very really optimistic, and so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to try to dig into understanding what it was that you were working on. I also love the idea of um, stories and the power of stories and connecting with the environment and with wildlife through our stories. Can I ask you, as you were thinking through the impact that you felt like this could have, like, where did you imagine that it could go? Like, what was the sort of vision of as if it worked, where could it have gone? How were you thinking about that?
Well, in my yeah, the way, I mean, the way that I was thinking about that was, 1 billion people interacting with wildlife stories on a daily basis.
Right.
And this doesn't mean spending hours, behind the screen, or hours every day playing. I mean, maybe for some people, right? But just
Sure.
how could there be 5 minutes a day where everybody at some point had some interaction with nature, either because they were actually in it, or because they were reading a story about it, or because they were playing a game about it, or because when they were buying their groceries, it was incorporated, or when they were driving their kids to school, it was incorporated. So just that was my vision. Still is my vision, or still is sort of my dream around, what I think we really need to do. And I was equating it to, well, TV is part of our lives. Politicians
Hmm.
are part of our lives every day. Music stars are part of our lives. Like there's all these things that are part of our daily life, and they
Yep.
influence us, sometimes consciously and sometimes subconsciously. But sometimes it's only just a few minutes a day that I have exposure to, to all these many different things. How is it that wildlife and nature can get a place at that table? And if it did, would it start to have as much of an influence on our lives as all the other aspects of popular culture? So it's not necessarily that I wanted to make wildlife popular culture, but it's not a terrible, it's not a terrible analogy to make, because it has such an influence on us. And yeah, if wildlife could have that same influence, that's what we're aiming for, what we're dreaming of.
And I think that's it's interesting and important to be really precise on that, because there's also a lot of solutions which are about using technology to connect with animals or trees or environments or habitats, but it's not from the perspective of trying to change the consumer and the consumer's habits and the consumer's culture. It's more about, can you could transfer some money over to this situation to save this orangutan, or to save this tree, and it's a transactional
Very.
purpose. You know what I mean? There's a few of those kind of solutions out there, but it seems what you were really trying to, the problem you were really trying to attack was the other way, which is like to influence a cultural change on the other end. And I think that's quite bold, as well as really intriguing difference from some of the other solutions I've seen. And would that be a correct assumption? What I'm
Yeah, that's totally right. When you say transactional, we say that all the time. Like, if you really look at what
right,
are the things that are out there, they treat people transactionally, right? Like, I think most of the conservation sector, when they say engagement, what they mean is, how can I engage you to click the donate button? And people are treated as a,
right.
as an opportunity to click the donate button and send. And there's nothing. I mean, this sector needs, 50 times the amount of money that's coming in. So,
Right.
all rights to get as much money as we possibly can. But
Hmm.
the ceiling of what we can achieve by emotionally engaging, people with the topic, is far greater than, than we'll ever be able to achieve with a very transactional relationship with people. And I guess what I've been saying a lot lately is, we all want everyone to have empathy for
Mm-hmm.
nature and empathy for animals and empathy for wildlife. But
Right.
we can't expect that unless we have empathy for them, right? And what's going on in their life? What are the trouble? What are the problems that they're facing? What is their day to day? What is the anxiety that they feel about climate change or the state of nature? And how are they being treated? What do they do on a day-to-day basis? And I think that the only way that we'll always get people to click the donate button. There'll always be this small group
Right.
of people, a couple million people that will do that. But if you really want to get beyond that and you want to kind of open that tent to everybody, I think we just need to start thinking about people much more in that way.
No, I think that I 100% agree with that, and I think that that's a growing um, movement. There is a growing movement towards trying to approach solutions from that perspective. So let's transition a little bit into, now that we've understood the problem you're trying to solve. Can we talk a little bit about some of the examples of solutions you've developed? And I guess I'd like to start with the first one I saw, which was the stories of the wild. Could you tell us a bit about that solution?
Yes, absolutely. So I think first off, like almost everything that we have done, it's always been a test
Right.
of something, of some concept. Like what are we testing here? What are we trying to see? And with
Mm-hmm.
Stories of the Wild, because we were very focused on all the scientific data that was being gathered, and we had a hypothesis that data can tell a story,
Mm-hmm.
and data can tell an engaging story. Um, well, that was probably one of the biggest things that we needed to test. And in this case, it was, can you take what would otherwise look like dots moving around a screen,
Mm-hmm.
and can you convey something emotional? Can you convey something that makes people lean in again, just to dots moving around a screen? So Stories of the Wild was really our first attempt at any type of proof of concept to say, okay, well, we've got some amazing data through some partners that we work with of lions, of elephants, and of wildebeest.
Mm-hmm.
When we look at that data, can we tell some really really quick stories about it in an aesthetically pleasing and quick way?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, I think we did. It was a really nice proof for us that yes, dots on a screen could be an entire business in a way. Like we could just continue to make these very beautiful visual representations of the data that's being gathered. But there were still, you still sit back and watch it, right? You're not part of it. You're not active. You're being told a story in a different way.
Right.
But if we want to tilt you into being engaged and leaning in, as opposed to leaning back, they were going to have to be a little bit more interactive and more active. But this was at least a first good test to see, can we just make dots on the screen? Can we make that interesting and emotional?
And so the dots on the screen in this example were representing um, animals moving around specific
Sure, GPS.
geographic
Yeah,
areas,
yeah,
right?
GPS locations based on. So these were animals that were collared, and so this was their. Yeah,
Yeah.
this was the GPS location of those animals over various periods of time, depending on which story you were looking at.
And so then, on a sort of practical, from a practical perspective, how did you test it? You created this visualization and then you just threw it out onto the internet, or you tested with some focus groups, or
Yeah, of course you throw it out on the internet, but the
yeah.
first thing that you do is you just watch what happens. And this is the thing. Nobody knows what they're going to get when you don't
Yeah.
tell them, and you just
Right.
like, here, yeah, well, watch this, and you just kind of see, what do they do? How does their body language shift?
Mm-hmm.
What do they talk to you about? What do they talk to you about afterwards? I showed it for the first time at a conference that you have lots of filmmakers,
Yep.
that were there, and I just showed one of them, and you have lots of people coming up to you afterwards and really talking to you about it, and again you just noticed a little bit of the body language of what people do. I wasn't trying, like, there's no way to test where, like, okay, tomorrow are you going to change your life or anything like that. You're just trying
Sure.
to see, like, are you getting a little bit of that, of that interest, because, well, then you've got your next problem, which is how do you get this in front of lots of people? And
Yeah.
that, even if you have a great product, if you don't know how to market it, or if you don't know how to get it out there, it's not going to matter. So you want to isolate, are people having the experience that you want, from whether you're actually managing to get it in front of the audience that you intended.
Okay, so there's a distribution issue. You also mentioned, though, that this test was about can you use dots on a screen to engage people in some kind of story. It sounds like you learned that you could, but perhaps it was more of a sit back kind of engagement than sort of an engagement to do something. And I'm sort of trying to transition to the next example, which was Run Wild, which was a partnership with Adidas, and I feel like you started to address some of those issues with that solution. Is that correct?
Yeah, so Adidas addressed a couple. The partnership with Adidas addressed a couple things. So one is, I mean, my big learning. I mean, I was in Accenture, right? I knew nothing about entrepreneurship. I knew nothing about making a
Right.
product, getting it out. I knew nothing about those things, right? So it might seem just really super obvious to say, like, our big learning is that marketing and distribution is the hardest aspect of this. But that
Right.
was, that is the first thing that you learn.
Yeah.
In that process. But and that's where it's like, well, we had this idea of, okay, so we had dots on the screen, we have all this movement, right? And it's like, okay, well, now how do we activate people? That, like, well, what if every day that when you ran and you checked your, like, oh, I ran, 8 miles today, or I took, better example is I did 15. There was the whole steps craze that was going on, right? Like, I did
Hmm.
15,000 steps, I did 8,000 steps. It's like, well, what if you could compare that? We have all this data about the steps that animals are taking. What if you could compare the number of steps that you took, again, with an individual wildebeest like Niatu, or an individual lion or something that was out there, and every day you were just seeing, like, yeah, I took 8,000. Oh, Valentine the lion took 6,000 today. I took a few more, and again, it's a funny thing, right? But it's just a little connection that I have with this animal, and every day I know what she's doing.
Right.
And then
Yeah.
maybe get a little bit of story. I was like, that would be amazing. Let's create a fitness app about that. Like, what are we going to do? We're not going to create a fitness app. Like, how are we going to? How it would be amazing, but how are we going to get anybody off? You're either going to have to migrate people off Strava and Adidas and to yours, or you're
Right.
going to get them to download a second one. It's never going to work.
Right.
As cool as it would be, we're going to have this very low ceiling of people that we're actually going to engage with. And that's like, well, what we need to do is figure out how to get all that data and all those stories and everything into an existing product that already has
Right.
150 million people
Hmm.
signed up and using it. And that's how the partnership with Adidas came about. You have to make a lot of compromises on the
Sure.
functionality and all the things that you want, but they've got, again, it's a built-in user base, and it's a built-in marketing machine.
Yeah.
um,
Right.
and so what we did was we partnered with different conservation organizations who had the data. It's like, hey, what do you think if all this data that you're collecting is represented in a fitness app, right? And it's just such a bizarre concept to anybody to think, like, what are you talking about? But we did
Right.
that. We figured out a little bit of a storyline around how much that animal was moving and it was running, and then Adidas
Right.
created these challenges that said, hey, in the next 10 days, can you run as much as a snow leopard? And every day you would find out how much Ulin the snow leopard ran. This isn't when we
Right.
did it with the snow leopard. And then you would
Yep.
see how much you ran, and then over 10 days you would try and see whether you did more or less. And what Adidas would also measure, of course, from their
Mm.
point of view, was, are people running more? A,
Right.
are people running more? B, are people using the app more?
Right.
And C, are people who weren't using the app now using the app, because this is something that engaged them. Um, And yeah, that's what that's what we were really that's what we were really trying to do. So that's something that ran for 3 years each year with with a different set of animals and a different set of conservation organizations, again, to see, can you get people engaged, can you get people a little paying a little bit more attention to what's going on with with these animals, if you give them an avenue to do so that doesn't make them do something entirely different than they're going to go running anyhow, they're using their
Right.
fitness anyhow, but now there's a way that wildlife is being incorporated into their daily life, just for a little a little bit every day.
Right. And so is that application still available, or well, that was a 3-year project?
No, they were yearly campaigns.
Okay.
And so, yeah, if I can just complain a little bit, like I had always had this vision that what would happen with this, and it would be steps to get there, but what would happen is it would be always on.
Right.
So a small community of people would always just be able to run at all times with all these different sets of animals that we would provide the data for. And of course, there's not going to be
Hmm.
150 million people, but maybe it's 10
Sure.
million people that are doing it all the time. Um, wasn't really able to get Adidas beyond the yearly campaign,
Right.
kind of approach to doing it, and I had no influence on the development team or the
Right.
features or anything like that. So after a couple years, I kind of realized that I'm not going to be able to kind of get this to the next level, and we've done a lot of what we intended to do. So yeah,
Hmm.
we essentially stopped, and I'm always still looking for that next opportunity where we can have it as an always on thing, but again, embedded into something that already exists.
Got it. And
Yeah,
so then the next project was the Unseen Empire. Could you talk us through how you came to that one, and the story behind that one?
sure.
I had to play with it online, and I found it really engaging and quite compelling.
Yeah, so I was having I get to meet a lot of really great, interesting people in many different
Hmm.
sectors in this job. So I was
Yep.
having a conversation with a gentleman named David McDonald, who runs a research unit out of Oxford University called Wild Crew.
Right.
It's probably one, if not the biggest, one of the biggest kind of sort of wildlife research institutions that there is, and
Hmm.
they've got people all over the world, doing scientific studies on mainly predators and carnivores.
Hmm.
So he was telling me about a 10-year study they had just completed on clouded leopard habitat across 11 countries in Southeast Asia, and they
Right.
had gathered 5 million camera trap images in the process of really trying to understand, where are the clouded leopards and what are the habitat conditions for them.
Right.
And I started looking at some of those images, and there's like 450 different mammals that are captured here, and I know a lot about animals, and I didn't recognize 70-80% of them. It was just spectacular stuff.
Right.
And I was thinking, but this is fantastic. It's amazing, and it's all being captured in these very scientific, dense journals, which
Right.
of course have a lot of value, and of course they're able to take that data and convince the creation of a few parks, etc., which is amazing. But I just was like, but this, like, how does the world see this? How does the world engage with this? Not with not with the scientific journal. And so it just
Right.
felt to me like we can create what I would just call a gamified data visualization,
Yep.
out of all this data, so that the stories of the habitat, the stories of the researchers, the stories of the stories of the animals, and the stories of the study come through
Hmm.
to again, to a much wider audience, and becomes consumable to a much wider audience than they could ever have than they ever could have done.
Right.
And so that coincided with something that was happening. That I got awarded a fellowship at National Geographic, um, which happened because they saw stories of the wild. And the head of storytelling came to me after she watched it, and she's like, "You need to apply for a fellowship and to do some really good data visualization stuff." So I had my choice of any projects that I could do around data visualization, and so yeah, we just kind of created this connection between National Geographic and Wild Crew, and came up with this idea of of an unseen empire of all these animals that you would never otherwise see if not for the camera traps that are out there, and this whole world that
Right.
exists, in the shadows in a way. Yeah, and that was what we that's what we built out of it.
Yeah, and it's really cool. The user experience is one where you're sort of placed virtually into an environment where there's all these camera traps on a geographic map, and then you're shown the actual photographs. I presume are the actual photographs that are coming from this database, and you play a game of essentially identifying the animals, as well as kind of virtually role playing the role of a scientist, right?
Yep,
Um,
absolutely.
and so I got my son to play it because I like to expose him to new game thing. He loves games, obviously, and he really enjoyed it. He loved the idea of um, him putting himself in that role and sort of thinking through, like, for him it was more not just the identification of the images, but he started to think through some of the ideas about the scientists having to trek through the forest, how they're going to
Yeah.
go in and get all of those images, download them, carrying them back, and he really got into that kind of part of the storytelling, which sort of made the whole experience a little bit more real for him. So I thought that was really quite compelling. Um, but then again, I guess for you guys, there's this question of what's the distribution of that, and or what is the end purpose, and so how did you go about that? Was it again sort of you just trying to build something on the internet and build engagement organically, or it was an experiment, and how do you think about that?
Well, we thought National Geographic was going to publish it.
Right.
So the whole time that we're that we were making it, it was in touch with, and there's never a guarantee, right? Like, so when National
No,
Geographic
sure, of
funds you
course
to
not.
when
Yeah.
they fund you to do work, they fund you to do work. They let you do whatever they want. They have the rights to publish it, but they don't guarantee that they're going to. And you do
Right.
whatever you do whatever you can to try and influence them to do it, because if they do it, you're going to get to and in this particular case, we knew that our audience was a National Geographic type of of audience. This Unseen Empire isn't like a entertainment game. It's
Right.
a it is a little bit more like, yeah, if you're interested in data visualizations and if you spend 10 minutes a day on the National Geographic website or something,
Hmm.
like, this is something that could engage you for much longer and at a much greater depth than anything else that they're doing. But I'm not, in this particular case, trying to reach all the runners of the world or something, or something like that.
Right.
So
Yeah.
National Geographic really was sort of the ultimate distribution mechanism, and ultimately they decided not to publish it because they didn't really have a way to do it.
Right.
They don't publish games. They don't really have a platform to do it. So sure, they can market it a little bit, but they didn't have a way to publish it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think they
Sure.
could have, but anyhow, this was that whole conversation. So when that happens, you're just like, oh, well, now what what are we going to do? And I think this is a little bit where the entrepreneurial story kind of comes in. It's like, well, there's so maybe there's different angles. Maybe we can go to the Smithsonian. Maybe we can go to Discovery Channel. Maybe we can go to BBC. Like, all these different possibilities. And plus, we had wanted to expand Unseen Empire to be like other. There's so many camera trapping projects that are happening all over the world. How can we
Right.
start bringing those in and really truly make this into something huge? Well, doing that takes a hell of a lot of effort. It takes a hell of a lot of
Yeah.
backbone. You have to make a lot of pitches. You got to figure out how to do that. David and Wild Crew had some appetite to do that because they of course loved this and all the attention that it was bringing.
Hmm.
CNN covered it. That helped us get a big boost. But again, we learned that press gets you a spike, but it doesn't get you
Right.
sustained, it doesn't get you sustained usership. And
Hmm.
then the next project comes along, and then now you're making a business decision about, okay,
Yep.
like, well, now the next project is here, and that's potentially some money coming in. If I do the next project, I can't keep putting the attention on on unseen unseen empire. And yeah,
Yeah.
again, from a business point of view, like, yeah, well, unseen empire is still here. If we ever serendipitously have the opportunity to do something more with it, we will.
Hmm.
But otherwise, we gotta move on to whatever is the next thing. And yeah, I mean, I think that's just one of the big difficulties of at least working in the space that I'm working, is that constant tension of trying to build upon what you've already built versus taking that next opportunity that's going to bring in some revenue.
Yeah. No, I can see that, and I'd like to maybe have a conversation about that. But before we get into sort of some of the
Yeah.
challenges, maybe we could just talk a little bit about the latest project, which is Fathomverse.
Hmm.
And so,
So
how did that one come about?
so Fathomverse is a project that we started working on with the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. And the
Right.
head of the research, or not the head of the research institute, but the head of the project in this particular case, was another National Geographic explorer. She knew about Unseen Empire. She knew about the things that we were doing. So we already knew each other. And she
Hmm.
asked me the question, again, we've got underwater rovers roaming through the ocean, taking pictures of absolutely every single thing under the ocean. We have millions and millions, millions of images and video hours of footage, coming in,
Hmm.
and we're trying to identify. This is a particular situation where they haven't identified those images. In Unseen Empire, all those images have been identified. We already knew what all those animals were because people had already gone through them and labeled them.
Right.
But with this, you need the help of AI to go in
Right.
and label all these images. But AI is only as good as the training that it receives.
Right.
And with a couple of people behind a desk, there's only so much volume that you're going to be able to give it. So her question to me was, can we make can we accomplish this sort of science objectives of trying to train AI,
Right.
but can we do that in a way where we can engage, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, to provide that training input in a fun way? So essentially, can we create a gamified citizen science product, with this?
Right.
And so yeah, we went through the whole process that we typically go through to kind of identify that, establish the objectives, establish the audience, kind of figure out the numbers. Here's how many
Hmm.
images you actually need to get labeled for it to be useful for AI. Can we reach that many people through the marketing channels you have? And a lot of those answers were coming back very positive.
Right.
Usually they don't. Like, usually,
Okay.
to tell you the truth, usually when we do these conversations, the answer comes back, let's not make a game. But in this
Right.
case, it was like, yeah, this could actually work. Let's see if we can create something that doesn't fall into all the standard pitfalls of citizen science products, and really make really go after making a game about this and see whether it can work. So that was the origin. That was the origin of the conversations, and we were very, very involved in working with them, finding a good game company to build it. We weren't the right organization in this particular case to build this. It
Right.
wasn't our style, but we could certainly help guide it in the right direction. And heavy user testing. And the user testing in this particular case, it was twofold. One is it actually helping? Are people are,
Yeah.
are people actually providing useful data? Because otherwise, this is a fun exercise. But at the end of the day, if you're just throwing away all the data because it can't be used, that's not serving the objective. But
Hmm.
also, is it fun enough that people will play it long enough to provide the volume of data, either as an individual or across a lot of people,
Right.
that we need? So you have to user test both. You have to user test both things to really figure out, like, is this going to be useful, and is it going to, is it going to be fun enough to get enough people to play it? So it was a great project where our user testing methodology was, I think, really really good, and now it's launching on May 1, in full. So there's been a few beta versions that have been out there. We've got hundreds of thousands of data points to really understand, and it will
Mhm.
launch in full on May 1.
Okay, fantastic. And so just to be clear on the experience, there's images that are coming from real life, where that are images of aquatic animals of some kind, and they're taken in the sea. They're then brought into the system, and AI can identify them sometimes. Like if it's a dolphin, AI will go, that's a dolphin. But there's a whole bunch of photos which AI can't necessarily identify. So then those go to the players of the game, who take guesses at trying to identify it, and that and like, you don't necessarily want one person to guess it and then that becomes the rule. It goes to many different people, and then you do sort of some machine learning, and then a decision is made, and then that's trained into the AI after that. Is it
Yeah,
something like that?
yeah, totally right. Yeah,
So
totally right. And
and
these
so
are these
that
are all based on images that, like, there's various dives that are happening at all times, and then all those
right,
images, are coming back. And yeah, you might be seeing, and you might be the first person to see an image. Or you might be
right,
the first
exactly.
person
That's
to you might be
cool.
the first person to label an image. You might be the first person to see a new species. We never know. So the big difference, the tricky part is when we show you the image, we don't know what it is yet.
Right,
Yeah, so, like, whereas in Unseen Empire, if you guess that something is, abandoned, a clouded leopard, we can tell you right away whether you're right or whether you're wrong, because it's already been labeled. In this case, we don't know.
right. It's real.
We can tell you what all sorts of other people have said. We can tell you what the likelihood is, but you only get the feedback, sort of. It's a delayed feedback mechanism where you get the feedback a little bit later, once enough data has been gathered to
Hmm.
properly establish, what it is. You find out later on, whether you were, well, quote unquote, correct, or not. So it's a really interesting approach of trying to figure out, well, what are the other incentive mechanisms? How do I give
Yeah.
you a feedback loop on what you're doing, when I literally cannot tell you, right now, whether you're right or wrong?
Yeah, no, it's an intriguing problem, and I love the potential for citizen science, and to bring it, bring citizen science into, to make it an actual real resource that's contributing real value
Yeah,
to a problem at scale like this. And so in this case, you know, based on your past experiences, what's the thinking around distribution, and
yeah.
is there a need for massive distribution, or how do you think about it for this?
For the data that they need to gather, for the amount of data that they need to gather, we don't need millions of users, right? We
Right,
need we need
engagement.
I don't know, 100,000. We need 100,000 users, just to, that play for X period of time, and that will serve the data objectives of
Right,
the game. If you're looking at the number of people that you want to engage with the ocean, well, you want more than those 100,000 people, because those
right,
100,000 people are already sort of probably, interested in that space. So now you're thinking, like, well, there's millions of people that go to aquariums every year. There's millions of people that go to museums. How can we start getting all of them engaged? Maybe we don't use their data as much, but now again, they're
right.
interacting with the ocean all the time. I tell you what. So at this stage, it is that network of aquariums, it is that network of museums, etc., that the Monterey Bay Aquarium is one of the most popular aquariums in the United States, and in the world.
Yeah,
So
right.
you have all the footfall that's just simply going through that museum on a daily basis, but you have
Yep.
their digital reach, and then you have all the partnerships that they have with all the other aquariums and all the other museums and all the other sort of ocean institute, things that are out there. So
Yeah,
at this point, sort of round one is to see how far that can get us. Yeah, and I think,
yeah, right.
the feeling is that can get us, pretty far. Round two, I think, again, when you're trying to scale it beyond that, I think we'll have to think, even more cleverly. I'll tell you what I really want to do. I
Yeah.
want to have a kiosk at the subway.
Right.
So you're about to get on this. You're sitting there. You're waiting for the subway, and
Hmm.
there's a little kiosk there that's showing you different images. And in the it's and in the 7 minutes or 3 minutes that you've been waiting to get on the train, you have a lot of people kind of gathering around the kiosk trying to make decisions about what something is or not. And like,
Right.
yeah, you as an individual probably only engage with it for 3 to 5 minutes, but the sheer volume of people that might engage with something like this, or
Right.
in the middle of Times Square, or at an airport. I think we need to think about things like that if we want to exponentially see how far and how many people can touch something like this.
Yeah, it's that's an interesting challenge. So I think it's quite interesting the solutions that you've evolved. If you don't mind me saying, there looks to be, you can see some of your sort of Accenture background in the way that you've approached solving these problems. You're an excellent problem solver, and you've been going to each one of these problems and solving them in the best possible way for that problem. But I guess, like, sort of broadly for Internet of Elephants, there's that remaining problem of how do you get repeatable distribution or repeatable solution or a repeatable product. So is that something you think about for in Internet and Elephants, or are you quite happy to continue going sort of separate project?
No,
How
we're
do you
not
think
happy.
about
We're
those?
not happy. Well, let me say this: if we're going to go project to project to project, then we need to lean into that and invest in doing
Right,
that well, right? So we
right,
never set out to do that, right? We set out
right,
to be we set out to be a product company, and we set
right.
out to be a company that builds a set of products,
Sure.
um, but a set of products that we invest in, that we build a user base around. That some are going to succeed, some aren't, and etc. And they start to generate their own revenue. That's what we set out to
Right.
be. We became an agency,
Hmm.
essentially, for the reason I mentioned previously, which is, when there's another project and that's going to bring in money, and you've got a few people, on the team, that's what you do. And I think this
Yep.
happens to a lot of product companies, especially in the games world, is they eventually become gaming studios.
Right.
And rarely work on the projects that the products that they really wanted to work on, because they're trying to be a good, and you can be a very good business that way. So
Yep.
if
Absolutely.
we had to make this decision that, well, if that's what we're going to be, then that's what we have to be, and we actually have to switch our business development model to go out and start selling to conservation organizations, selling to zoos, selling to aquariums,
Right.
and making it a business that way. But if we're not willing to do that, then we shouldn't just kind of continue down this path, because we're not kind of accomplishing what we wanted to accomplish. So we did, about a year and a half ago, make this decision that, like, or I said, we need to, in a way, stop. And
Hmm.
stopping is difficult because a lot of people, the people on your team get affected by the fact that you stop. But we need to
Yeah. Sure.
stop, and we need to rethink, if we were to build Internet of Elephants today, how would we build it? uh,
Right.
from scratch, but with the benefit of everything that we've learned, the networks that we've created, and the credibility that we've established, that
Yeah.
that are in our back pocket. But how would I build this up from scratch? Would I build an agency? Would I build a product company? Would I build a platform?
Right.
Um,
Exactly.
and we did a lot of work on that, and a lot of thinking, and a lot of workshops with a lot of different people. And we actually kind of came up with what I would call as a lab.
Yep. Right.
And I know that the word lab is used everywhere, and everybody's got a lab these days.
Right.
But when I really thought about the experimental nature of what we were doing, when I thought
Hmm.
about the fact that almost everything that we do, it's the first time that it's been done. When I thought about the amount of testing that needs to happen in order to find the things that stick, and then when I thought about the impact nature of what we were trying to accomplish, I was just like, but we are a lab, but we're not
Right.
operating like a lab. We're trying to pretend that we're not. We're trying to pretend that we're this company that's going to make tons of revenue and and figure and on the first try, and we're not going to be able to we're not going to be able to do that. So let's instead actually create ourselves as a lab with a charter to be a lab slash venture studio in a way that
Yeah.
does these experiments. And when we build enough evidence that something that we're doing has the legs, has the revenue potential, has the distribution model, has the partnerships to do something, then let's go ahead and spin that out into a
Right.
separate entity that can then, take that, raise its own money and make a business out of it. And let's let the lab continue to try these new things. Let's let the lab think about the metaverse. Let's let the lab think about Web3. Let's let the lab think about gambling. Let's let the lab think about biodiversity credits, right? Like, whatever it happens to be, let the lab
Hmm.
do those experiments to build the evidence, and then start spinning them out. Um, it's a little bit the best analogy that I found out there was MIT Media Lab, which I think does something that does something very very similar, and I really just like Internet of Elephants needs to be the MIT Media Lab of the of the conservation of the conservation space, or of the wildlife and nature space. So that's really sort of the next place that I would like to take it. It has all its own challenges,
Yeah. Sure.
associated with it, but in terms of what we're trying to accomplish, I think that's it's the right model for us to try and accomplish it. So yeah, we are now not just taking the next project and the next project.
Yeah. So that whole experience that you went through, having to reflect on what you are, what you thought you were, and what you're doing, and making a decision about that, I think is really critical. And um, I, I do a lot of work advising entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, to help them to grow their organizations. And this I come across repeatedly, where entrepreneurs get locked into an idea of what they thought they wanted to be. In the reality of being an entrepreneur, you have to make certain decisions, and you to keep things moving forward and keep things alive. And so you make certain decisions. You end up sometimes going a slightly different way. And if you don't reconcile those things, and you don't bring it back together and make a decision and say, yes, okay, we're going to go that way, or we're not, we're going to stop pretending that we're that, and we're going to be this. If you don't do that, that's where things go wrong. And I think so. It's quite cool to hear that you've been through that, and now you're building a more aligned and focused future. So that's it's cool to see that.
I mean, I think we should have been doing that every. I mean, it took us 6 years to do it, or
Yeah, yeah,
five
right.
and
It
a half.
takes
Yeah, and
it
I think we
takes
should be.
time.
I think we should be doing it every year. I think I think we should be doing it every year. And sometimes the answer would be like, yeah. Again, my big thing at Accenture was conscious decisions. Conscious decisions. I don't mind if we make mistakes.
Yep, sure.
But I want those to be like, yeah, but we consciously decided to do this, and it was a mistake, as
Right.
opposed to it just happened,
Yep.
and then we found ourselves in a situation, but we never actually made any decisions that led us to here. It was just sort of the lack of conscious choices. And I think,
Yep.
like, yeah, again, as an entrepreneur with with the business, etc. Like, I want us to, like, we became an agency without choosing to become one.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Um, Again, it wasn't bad, but we didn't choose to to go down that path. And if we did, we would have done some things a little bit differently. So I wanted to get kind of back to some of those principles around conscious decision making.
Where you see Internet of Elephants going forward? What model are you going to be trying to implement to grow, take the next steps of your journey? So if you could talk to us a little bit about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a great question, because I would say about a year and a half ago, we got to a certain point. And we were doing, we were doing okay. We were doing cool projects. We were working with great organizations. We were putting stuff out that we were proud of. But we were definitely struggling both to see the impact of what we were doing, sort of the broader impact. I think we inspired a lot of people, but we set out to do more than inspire people. Um, and then certainly financially, we were just kind of barely getting by. Um, and so we really did a relook at it and said, like, let's stop, let's see what's happened. What are the conscious decisions that we're making about our business, and what are the decisions that are being made for us, or that we're sort of that we're backing into. And what we really realized is we're kind of an agency. We've kind of become this agency that goes from project to project by project to project. And of course, it's super fun and interesting to do lots of new projects. But that's not what we set out to do, right? Like we set out to make products, and then make those products better, and then make those products better, and build a user base, build a revenue model, and then start expanding from there. And we're not doing that. And we've sort of become an agency that goes from project to project, and we look for funding or we look for projects, but we're not investing in doing that. We're not doing any BD around that. We're not going out there and thinking about, who are all the possible customers. So we're stuck in this middle place of not doing what we had set out to do, and not investing in what we've actually become. So we need to make some decisions here about how to do this. And so we basically asked ourselves a question: if you were to start Internet of Elephants from scratch today, A, would you do it? And B, if you were to do it, how would you do it? With the advantage being that, but you've got 5 years or 6 years of learning at this point. You've got credibility, you've got networks, and so on and so on. So you have a lot more than you actually had when you started it. But how would you start it again? And we said, would we be an agency, and commit to it? Would we, try and become a product company? Would we become a platform, in a way that allowed, other products to be built upon it? Or would we, the other option we came up with, and what we ultimately chose was to become a little bit more like a lab. And I know that the term lab is, there's a million labs out there. Everybody's got a lab. But we really started to think, but like, what's really the true essence of a lab, right? And what does it really mean to be a lab? And we thought it's about asking questions, and then running experiments to find out the answers to those questions, and then hopefully informing the ability, for those answers to be taken, up a little bit, a bit greater. And we looked at MIT Media Lab, and that, I mean, I read through it and I was like, this is it, right? Like what they are out there. They are asking, very interesting questions about media. They're running experiments. They're running them quickly. They're doing them not, partially academic, but much more, in the market. And then for the things that have evidence that they can be taken forward, they're spitting those out into their own entities or their own projects that then take on a life of their own, while the lab sort of continues to focus on experimentation and questions. And when I looked at that, I said, well, everything that Internet of Elephants has ever done has essentially been the first time that it's ever been done. Everything that we do is an experiment. That's what's happening here. That is a model in itself, right? Like, you can't pretend that you're going to have that model, but then pretend that somehow that's going to be a product company or an agency. So we actually are a lab, but we're trying to pretend that we're something different. Maybe we should continue to be a lab, but be a lab, and create a methodology around being a lab, and lean into it, make it part of our charter, as opposed to, pretending that maybe we'll, be some the next Fortnite of environmental, games, or the next, huge brand agency that does things in this space. So that's how we've sort of rethought. Like, yeah, if I were to do this again, which I am, that's the way that we really felt was the, best way to achieve the goals that we had set out for originally.
And so, being a lab, how would you categorize the theme of your lab? Would it be sort of just helping NGOs do certain things with data, or how would you think about that?
Yeah, good question. So I think of us as a lab for public engagement, and creating the most sort of innovative approaches to how we engage the public with conservation and wildlife, right? So that's what we've always been about. We've been about public engagement. I'm not trying to shift away from public engagement. It's still the North Star. It's still the thing that we think is critical to the conservation space. It's still the area that we think is lacking in solutions, and it's still the problem that we're trying to solve, right? But it's really hard. It really requires a lot of testing, a lot of trying of different things. There's so many different possible audiences and ways that you can do it. So the lab is entirely focused on engaging the public with nature and engaging the public with wildlife. Now, say 5 years down the line, we just are the masters at finding the solutions, and spinning those out in that particular space. Maybe it can expand to engagement with other topics. We become the lab for engagement, and it's not just a lab for wildlife engagement. But in the beginning, you need to focus on what you know, and yeah, and kind of keep your organization focused on a particular area of expertise. So that's the area that we'll focus on. Obviously, we'll have a bent towards solutions that involve technology. Again, that's something that can grow. Again, maybe 5 years down the line, we're so good at engagement that we don't even, it's like it doesn't even need to be technology related. But right now, that's what we know. And so let's go ahead and keep that as a constraint for us as well.
Okay, no, I think that's a really excellent framing in terms of public engagement around conservation and wildlife, because in our previous discussion, I had the feeling there was more focus on sort of the gaming side, but by saying it's about public engagement, it's broad enough, right? That you can the solutions can be in all sorts of different verticals, but then limiting it to conservation and wildlife, it's very focused at the same time. So
Yeah.
that seems like a really nice framing for you.
And honestly, I think gaming will be the biggest vertical because we see it as the biggest opportunity. But I agree with you. There's other verticals that might be in there that may not necessarily be games, but are still sort of digital, in their orientation, or the way that they're done. A big part of the lab, um, and the way that I think about it is, you can run the risk as a lab of just running every possible experiment, right? So the thing that you have to have is a really strong methodology and a criteria around what do you take on, and whatnot. It can't just be the coolest stuff. So because I personally can get very, very trapped into that. But I think we want to make sure, like, okay, obviously it's got to be around public engagement, but that audience needs to be, we have to be able to say that audience is an audience that's not otherwise being reached. So just shifting the people that are donating to WWF and then just kind of getting them to come onto our platform, maybe that's a really good business strategy to take market share away from one organization and bring it to whatever you're doing. But that's not an impact strategy. We're not trying to shift people around within the same sphere. So we need to be able to show how this is reaching audiences that are, and demographics that are otherwise not being reached. And I think we need to also show, and they go right, hand in hand, is that there is a marketing approach that's built in. So I don't really want to take on projects that then require us to spend millions of dollars that in marketing, or hope on some sort of viral campaign, right? So if we can't think of what's the marketing angle to this, what's the brand partnership that's going to take care of the marketing, then it's not a good candidate to move forward, because ultimately you might again build something that looks really amazing and engages people, but you're just going to get stuck at the hardest piece anyhow. So the lab needs to look at these criteria and say, we're only going to go forward with experimentations where some of this stuff is already built in, and now let's go ahead and prove out its potential.
No, it's really interesting. To For a lot of people who might be listening to this, the idea of a lab might be quite foreign, and so could you help us to understand, like, what is the structure of a lab, or how does it work? Like, is it that NGOs would come to you with a problem? Is it that entrepreneurs might have this great idea and then they come and work with you. How do you see that working? If you
Yeah,
could just paint a picture of what that looks
sure.
like.
And again, I think the word lab is used in many, many different contexts. Some people call them R&D departments. Some people, say, call it a lab. And they run the gamut from being incubators to venture studios to accelerators to to actual R&D units for organizations. Um, I I see the lab as a lean entity that's focused on running experiments to answer questions and running those experiments quickly, right? Like we're not out there to run a 3 to 5 year academic study to figure stuff out in theory and then publish a paper. We're out to put stuff in the market, right? Like the only way you reach audiences is by putting it in the market, and often your best approach to experimentation is put it out there, see what happens, iterate on it, put it out there again, iterate on it, put it out there again, and build up the level of evidence that you need to determine is this something that can go forward or go forward or not. So I really look at us as a lab that's intended to, within 3 to 6 months, figure out what's the fastest, cheapest way to answer all the unknowns surrounding a particular question around engagement, and run those, and then make decisions as to what to do. Now, where do the ideas for those experiments come from? They could come internally. They could just be something that me and the team sit in a whiteboard and have a bunch of questions up on the board, and we come up with some ideas around particular audiences that we want to reach, or particular technologies that we think have potential, etc. Right? Like I would imagine hundreds of ideas. But I also see scenarios where entrepreneurs that are out there, young, scientists that are out there, tech innovators that are out there, say like, well, I've got this particular idea or this thesis around what I think can be accomplished in the, in a particular space, but I don't have the ability to take that forward or do what I need to do in order to, to make that happen. I want the lab to be a place where they can come. It still gets thrown into the pile, and then the pile is still evaluated on all the criteria, but it doesn't matter to me whose idea it is. And then we run the experiment, and then if there's enough evidence that person should then be able to go and take it and and make something big out of it. It can be something, hopefully eventually, where brands start to see the value in what we're doing and what we're creating, to say like, oh, well, we've got, we're KLM, and we really want to engage our audiences on the topic of, deforestation in the Amazon or any of the locations that we fly to as KLM. But we don't know how to do that. We don't know what will, how can we use the different digital products that we've got in place to make that happen. Amazing. There is, the Wild Ideas Lab that exists just to do this. They come, and we work with them, together to try and find the solutions, and then that's something that they make happen if they see the evidence of it. So I think that there's a few different ways that it can come about. Um, it's yet it's yet to be seen, what we're able to do, but that's kind of how I see it. That's how I see it, evolving over time.
Sure. And we talked before previously about a little bit about some of the challenges of funding. How does that? How does the funding challenge frame up for a lab? Because it seems
Yeah.
like it would be a different kind of challenge. That
It is a different challenge. I don't think it's going to be any easier for us to fund this as a lab than what we were trying to do in the past. Probably the easiest thing to fund is an agency. Um, but at least we're being very, very clear and direct about, like, this is what we are. Yeah, we are an experimental organization. Yes, the intention is to eventually spin off ventures, which we hope will make money. Yes, the intention is to build this amazing body of data that would be really, really interesting to all the brands out there about how different people are engaged with different topics. We will have that. Yes, those are the things that we're intending to do, but we are a high risk, high experimental, type of organization, and as a funder, you have to buy into that. There's not going to be very many that do. our hope is that there's going to be a few that say that's exactly what's needed. So as much as I want to try and get away from it, the reality is I think the first five years of this is philanthropic funding, and it's finding the right sort of family foundations, individual philanthropists, individual business people that believe in the power of business, people that believe in the outcomes of what we're trying to do and are able to fund, let's say, the first 5 years of building this up until the organization can actually start having a much better business case to raise a different type of a different type of you know just to mention, we've been thinking about membership models, and again, the MIT lab works on a membership model. Of course, they're MIT; they have access to a lot of things that we don't have. But again, the idea is eventually the output of what we're doing. Who does that create value for? Right? How can we take what we're doing and say, hey, here's all the things that we now know. How can that be of value to other organizations, and how can you buy in through different membership models to give you access to that information, influence that information, and perhaps bespoke projects to help your particular organization. So it's one of the revenue models that we see. Again, looking at using MIT Media Lab as inspiration. Again, I recognize that MIT Media Lab has a reputation that's built upon many years and reputation that we don't have, but I think that's kind of what we want to.
But I think that model's worth exploring, particularly when you consider the fact that you're trying to solve the problem of public engagement, and in this sector, the organizations that have the biggest struggle with that are NGOs, and there are hundreds of thousands of NGOs out there trying to solve that problem, and it's I could see how. So you don't need a massive number of them to become members to be able to make something that's sustainable. And the other part of that is there's so many different ways that NGOs need support in trying to engage the public themselves, right? And a lot of it is around visualization, right? Visualization of data that they have that's hard to share, and they just don't have the resources, right, on an individual NGO basis. So I feel like there's a huge market there, and there's a huge problem that if you could bring those things together could be something interesting as well.
Absolutely. The only thing I guess what I would say is I think we of course want NGOs to be members, but I don't see that. I haven't thought about that as the revenue model, because I don't think that there's enough. Well, there's plenty, but if we just kind of narrow it to the conservation space, that would have enough to be able to fund the cost of the lab and the cost of the experiments. But I do see that there's a number of corporates who are much better at public engagement than NGOs that have the opportunity to actually lend their expertise, lend some of their financing, and I shouldn't even say lend, but give access to their audiences that can make a massive difference. And so if we can figure it out, the bigger power is in trying to figure out how do we get corporate members to be part of this lab, because they recognize that the benefit to their customers and the benefit to the things that they're trying to do. But look, I don't want to be totally naive. I don't 100% know, but I think that's that's part of what we want to try and figure out over the course of the next couple of years. Is that something that we can make as a sustainable model, or do we just sort of say like, yeah, you know what, it's just always going to be philanthropic until we start spitting out ventures that can generate income that then goes ahead and funds the lab. So there's a few different possibilities of what could happen. There's a few different fallback plans. yeah, and I mean that in itself would be a big experiment.
Yeah, no, agreed. So it's interesting when you looking at your journey, how you've evolved and you've had to pivot from where you originally were. Um, this is in my experience in supporting and advising NGOs and social enterprises. This is one of the biggest challenges that I see is entrepreneurs who think they're one thing, but in fact they're forced into doing another thing, and they never bring that back into alignment. So it's cool to see that you've got to the point where you're now bringing that back into alignment, and you're now making a pivot into what you think you need to do going forward. But I guess my question is from your experience now of the last few years being in this new sector, um, I'm interested to know what are the sort of the learnings you've taken in, having had this experience now.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that I was naive about in many different ways. Number one is, at least for us, is around marketing and distribution, and how hard that is, how expensive it is, how crucial, how crucial it is to, to everything that, that we're doing. And then there's lots of sub learnings under that. But ultimately, like I get, I probably have a conversation a week or a conversation every 2 weeks with somebody who comes to me with an idea and wants to, make a game or wants to do something around a product or an engagement thing. And the conversation is all, for me, it's always we can make anything amazing, but we can't get it in front of people, as easily as we can make a really good product. So unless you have a plan, a distribution channel, connections, whatever it happens to be, to get it in front of the audience that you're trying to reach, don't do it. And that's what I would have said to myself on, because the projects are really cool, huh? They're really they're working with animals, and we're making games, and we're telling great stories, and we're using tech. I mean, everything about the products, they're fantastic. I can come up with one every 10 minutes, and so the temptation is to do it, uh, and that's okay. But if you do it in a way where you're trying to actually figure out the marketing challenges along the way, and you do it in this very iterative process, rather than thinking about marketing at the end. So I think we got much better about that at the end. Or sorry, not at the end, but to more recently, as opposed to when I started, I was just completely clueless about what it takes to actually to get in front of the audience that you want to get in front of. I think that's number one. And I guess number two would be that whole iterative approach, and thinking about how can we answer the biggest unknowns in the fastest, cheapest way possible, rather than get super excited about the product that we're going to build, hold very idealistic vision, idealistically to the vision that we have around what we want to do, build it, and then find out that, as it turns out, what we thought was really important made no difference, to the audience that we were trying to get in front of. And again, I think we got better on that over time. But now it's just a fundamental core thing that we ask ourselves on any project that we take on.
Yeah, I like that one. Iterative progress. It's hard to actually own and to execute when you come from a more traditional approach to building solutions.
Yeah.
But it is hugely important. But both of those things that you mentioned are things that you could have learned in any context, I guess. Are there any learnings that are very specific to the conservation or the wildlife or this whole sector that jump out to you? Because it is different, this sector from other sectors.
Yeah. Um, we were. I don't remember if I mentioned it before, but we were lucky to very early on be introduced to people who are very, I think, thoughtful about wildlife storytelling, nature storytelling, climate storytelling. And we were influenced by them very, very early on to take a particular route. And it it's very easy for me to see how you wouldn't take that route. Like you would take the route of messaging, with doom and gloom, or messaging to get people to care, or messaging, uh, to get people to do something. And I think that's the standard in the conservation space. I think we might have spoken about this before. That's the standard in the conservation space is to use those approaches. And I can see that we might have just kind of fallen into that as well. And I think that very fortunately, very early on, we learned a lot and we got introduced to the right people to really create a kind of a specific point of view on how this should happen. I think the other thing that we learned early on was, I mean, these issues are not black and white. It's so easy to reduce conservation to hunting is bad, not hunting is good. Palm oil is bad, not palm oil is good. Zoos are bad, not zoos is like it's so easy to just kind of take these very, very black and white stances, on things. 30% of land conserved and protected. Like there's all these lines that are drawn, and it's easy to message. It's easy to talk about, in those ways, but it's not true. It's not authentic. It's not the reality, and it often does so much more harm, than good. I talked recently with somebody. He is totally anti-hunting, and what he told me was that he thinks that the number one threat to wildlife in Africa, at least, is hunting bans, right? And so it's one of those things where you can be completely against the act, but the reality, but like if you're thoughtful about it, you can see that there's nuances to these things. And I'm not kind of stating my claim on any of these, on any of these areas, but what I do see that we're a sector that, or the media, whoever it is, wants things to be very, very black and white, and it's not. And that's where the storytelling becomes so critical, to do it in a way that it doesn't, sort of push that onwards.
Yeah, I think that's a really important note, and I do see there I do see a slight change in the sector around this storytelling. I do see a more sort of uh, optimistic and pragmatic storytelling coming through, and so I'm optimistic myself that will change. I'm conscious of the time and also
Hmm.
the weather, and
Yeah, you
and
can tell, huh? It's
and
getting darker and darker and fuzzier and louder and louder.
yeah. And so to kind of wrap up, I like to end discussions by asking the entrepreneur if they can think of any advice that they would give to eco entrepreneurs or young people that are looking to get into to creating an organization to do something to save the world, so to speak. And I'm interested to know what your advice to future entrepreneurs might be.
Yeah. I mean, number one is do it with someone, co-founder, partner, whatever it happens to be. If I could do it all, if I could do it all over again, and I kind of am, but it would be to have done it with a co-founder. And there's so many co-founders. There's so many. I'm sure to introduce some challenges, but there's so many benefits that that would come from it. As I look back, I think, oh my God, we could have I could have accomplished a lot more in this period of time if there was if there was somebody with me. And I think two main reasons for that. One is, as an entrepreneur, you shoulder the burden of everything, of your organization, of your employees, of the accounting, of the pitches, of the vision, of the fundraising, of the product. And like everything falls on your shoulders. And there's ups and downs, and there's nothing you're going to be able to do about the ups and downs. But again, as the entrepreneur, you have to shoulder every single one of those downs. Every email that comes in that's bad news or whatever, that all rests on you. So one thing is having co-founder shares the burdens, it shares the joys. It at least my perception of what it would do. I think it would have been emotionally a massive thing to have somebody else with as much stake in this as I have. And then I think secondly, sort of on that same topic, but you got to know about everything. Like I got to know about marketing, I got to know about games, I got to know about accounting, I got to know about legal, I got to know about immigration. I need to know about like I got to you got to know about absolutely every. It's a lot to know that much as as one person. So it would have certainly been fantastic to have somebody that had complementary skill sets. Like, okay, I happen to not be that good on marketing, but my co-founder is the person that's going to figure that out. Or, oh my God, we got to get this paperwork in to satisfy the Kenyan. There's somebody else that's just taking. Maybe neither of us know him, but there's somebody else that's doing it. So I think that there's this idea of the sort of complementary skill sets where you can work together, but each of you have skill sets that you bring, but then you also sort of shoulder the burdens and the joys together. So for me, that's the biggest thing that I would advise to somebody else is don't try and take it on yourself.
Yeah, no, I'd 100% agree with that. I would also even argue that it goes back to the iterative development approach. When you're by yourself, the only way you can really test out any of the ideas that you have is to build something and put it out there. Whereas when you have co-founders, you're constantly testing ideas with someone else, and that
Yeah,
allows you to do sort of virtual idea testing before you have to put anything out. So
yeah.
super helpful in
Oh,
multiple
it
ways.
would have been so great all these years to have somebody to do that with.
Well, maybe in the next iteration of Internet of Elephants as a lab,
Yeah,
you'll be able to approach it in that way.
that's the intention.
Great. So, Gautam, thank you so much for taking the time to join us for two times to finish this conversation. Greatly appreciate it. It's really exciting to see the work that you've done and to see where you're going. I'm very positive that the community will really appreciate hearing your story. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.